Started here in Lake Havasu City, was politically active in my youth, was a teenage Republican. This was a very Republican community during the Reagan era. We grew up very optimistic, very idealistic. Obviously the weather is terrific, and then you add the London Bridge and spring break and all that kind of stuff. This was a great place to grow up. From here, graduated high school here, went to Arizona State University, majored in communications at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism. From there, I went to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, became the evening anchor in Myrtle Beach. South Carolina was a wonderful place to be, particularly for the 2008 election. From 2006 on, we had candidates tripping over each other for 2 years, leading into that South Carolina primary, which is the second primary in the process and the first in the South. I actually grew up around John McCain all of my life. I circulated brochures for him in his first campaign down in Phoenix in the early 80s. And when I left Yuma, he was one of my last interviews on the border. We did a border story with Senator McCain, and I said to him, "Senator, I'm going to South Carolina. We might not see each other again for a while." And 6 years later, I got a phone call, and it was McCain on the phone saying, "I'm coming to Greenville. Do you want to follow along?" So I drove up to Greenville in 2006, and for 2 years, I saw John McCain more in South Carolina than I ever did here in Arizona as he campaigned for that nomination. He ended up winning that South Carolina primary. And so that was an amazing election cycle, and I thought that I wanted to write a book about that, but there wasn't quite enough. So my career took me to Columbus, Ohio, which was the epicenter of battleground states. It's a state where I was born and know a lot about. I've been a Buckeye fan all of my life, and Columbus was the place to be for the 2012 election, covering Obama and Romney as they tripped around Ohio trying to win its electoral votes, and seeing once again John McCain, who was campaigning for Mitt Romney. And that's my career track, and now back in Arizona writing books and the publisher of website JimHeath.tv. My book reads a lot like Game Change. It gives you a lot of information about what was happening around the time period where I interviewed these candidates for president, both in South Carolina in 2008 and in the state of Ohio in 2012. It kind of takes you through and gives you some of the background of where the candidates were at and what the campaign was like. And I think it's an insight into how these presidential campaigns work. In South Carolina in 2008, on both sides, Republican and Democrat, you had a wide open field. It was the first time in 50 years where an incumbent vice president or president was not running. So you literally had these, what I call the titans of candidates. You had Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, Rudy Giuliani, John McCain, just really grade A candidates fighting for their nominations. And then 2012, of course, there's no better place to be in a presidential election year than Ohio. Richard Nixon said back in 1960, as a presidential candidate, you plant your flag in Ohio and you work out from there. And 2012 is exactly what Mitt Romney and Barack Obama did, each knowing that if they could win Ohio, they could likely reach 270 electoral votes. There are a lot of stories in the book that show you kind of behind the scenes personalities of these elected officials and these candidates for president. One of them was being on a campaign ride with Mitt Romney, and he prepared peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for everybody who was hungry at that particular moment. Of course, traveling around with Senator McCain on his campaign bus was legendary because he was so relaxed and he was so in his element with reporters, which was completely unusual because most politicians are not that comfortable. There are other moments that I give in the book. John Edwards is an example, who was a leading contender in 2008. He had won the South Carolina primary in 2004. He got out of his vehicle very angry, very upset at his staff. You notice body language, you notice that something's going on. My photographer, Kevin Abity, after our interview went and he got some B-roll of the Edwards together. When we looked at the tape later that day, we noticed that night that John and Elizabeth Edwards were not holding hands as they were walking in a parade. We didn't know exactly what that meant, but I remembered that we noticed it. And of course, a month later, it turned out that he had been having an affair, and she had known about that during that time period. So things begin to make sense through body language and through some of the reactions of the candidates, and the book certainly gives a lot of examples of behind the scenes and what these candidates are really like. Fred Thompson, another example, he was an actor who got into the presidential race in 2008 very late. He had been in movies, Hunt for Red October, as an example. And talking to him about policy was almost excruciating because he wasn't very well prepared in his run for president. But as soon as you mentioned his movie career, he lit up, and he spent a lot of time talking about the Hunt for Red October and LA Law, which was a television show that he was on. So these are the nuances when you sit face to face with these individuals who want to lead the free world. So I think that this book, it's fun in some regard because it shows the human side of candidates and campaigning, but also the more serious side of television advertising, the influence of media, which is growing increasingly conservative, not liberal, but conservative. And right now, Republicans have the White House, they have the House, they have the Senate, they have 2/3 of governorships, and they have 2/3 of state legislatures across the country. And so a lot of Republicans are getting asked a lot of questions. And I can see where this preconceived notion of bias comes in, because a lot of Republicans are asked more questions than the Democratic minority. But the truth is that Republicans are in power, and as long as they remain in power, they'll continue to get a lot of tough questions, as Democrats will, if and when they regain power. You know, the relationship between politicians and the press has always been rough. You know, people think Barack Obama loved the press. I can assure you Barack Obama didn't like the press much at all. And as a matter of fact, as I wrote in my book, the AP took him to court because of the lack of transparency of the Obama administration. We were always complaining that the Obama administration was doing everything it possibly could to crush out whistleblowers, as an example, people who would come forward to talk about what was going on in the government. So this myth that somehow Democrats love the press, I mean, Hillary Clinton loves the press? Are you kidding me? I mean, from the time she was a first lady and the stories she had to endure about her husband. She, as his wife and as the first lady, starting in that time period, developed an adversarial relationship with the press as well. And I think that's healthy. I don't think hatred and anger is particularly healthy. I do think that there should be an arm's length relationship between the political press and politicians. In the case of President Trump, it's not just arm's length, but it's a Grand Canyon. And it's a lack of respect. I think a lot of it, if I try to understand where Donald Trump is coming from, I think a lot of it is the fact that he doesn't have the political background that just about everybody else that we've covered has had. And so there's not a lot of respect, and there's not a lot of nuance, and there's not a lot of understanding of the traditions of the relationship between politicians and the press. And so everything is hard-edged now. You know, a lot of politicians at least have the finesse to round those edges a little bit. And with Trump, he just says what he says and he tweets what he tweets. And it really strikes a lot of Americans and a lot of people in the press the wrong way. But I do think that that's just a lack of understanding of the traditions of the role of the political press corps and presidents and other elected officials. So social media has been responsible for the proliferation of news, and not necessarily in a good way, because it goes out unfiltered, it goes out without a lot of background information and without fact checking. And all of a sudden, if you're a partisan and you get something that hasn't been fact checked, but it looks good to you because that's your personal point of view, it gets spread like wildfire, and it's very difficult to put that genie back in the bottle. And so from a journalist standpoint, you're basically working in what I call hurricanes now, political hurricanes, because you can be concentrating on a story, trying to fact check it and trying to get double sources on it. But what's taking off on social media in the world of Twitter and Facebook is very different, and you've got to try to address that, the immediate concerns, combined with doing your old-fashioned fact checking and getting double sources on it. So I think social media has been the biggest culprit in the change of tone over the last decade. It's allowed partisans to express their point of view, and it's allowed partisans to do that without fact checking or really even being worried about facts. And it makes a political journalist's job even that more difficult, because all of a sudden, if you're delivering the facts and it doesn't correlate with the partisan spin, then it must be fake news, which is completely erroneous. There have been several big changes in campaigning in the last decade. Social media, obviously, at the top of that list, but also I would think just as important is the proliferation of dark money. The overturn of McCain-Feingold by the Supreme Court has just had a drastic, traumatic effect. from a political journalist point of view. It's not that millionaires and billionaires and special interests have not always tried to have their input into our political system. It's just that now they can do it anonymously. And as a journalist, when you can't track how the money is perhaps affecting the votes of politicians on the other end of the contribution, then something is wrong, something is haywire. And that's what that Supreme Court decision did. And so, the lack of ability now to track exactly who's contributing how much and how those politicians are responding when they get elected, that's a big story. And I think that's going to continue to be a big issue until we have a clear case of a politician who was literally bought and paid for, and that can be proven by journalists. I think that case will make its way back to the Supreme Court again, and I think they'll take another whack at that issue. But between now and then, we're just going to have to wait, and we don't know what the influence of this dark money is doing on our current politicians, and we won't know until there's a scandal of some sort that exposes it. And then I think we have another concern that we're going to have to just wait for, and that's reality TV. The millennials and Gen Z and the younger generation of what their expectations will be of candidates for high office. Is Trump an anomaly? I mean, is he just somebody who came along who is different than all the rest, and we're going to return to more traditional candidates who have a political background? Or is there an expectation that we need to be entertained? Are we entertaining you? Are candidates going to have to have a little bit more flamboyance and flair to get any traction in this social media age? And we don't know the answer to that. My gut intuition is that Trump will be won and out, and we'll get back to more civility, and we'll get back to more traditional presidential politics. My gut intuition was wrong about him ever being elected, though. So I'm the first to admit that we could be going the exact opposite direction, where a Kanye or a Rock could, step forward and say, okay, and then all of a sudden, when those names come forward as a political journalist, where I used to laugh when Trump was mentioned, now I don't laugh anymore. Now it's like, I wonder what kind of coalition that entertainer can put together. Is that the age we're in now? Only time will tell. The irony, if I were to write this book today, is that I called it Front Row Seat at the Circus then. I thought it was a circus when I covered 2008 and 2012, and I actually end my book, Front Row Seat at the Circus, with a Trump tweet at the time that caught my attention. On election night 2012, he tweeted out an attack on Karl Rove, the famous Republican operative, blaming him for Mitt Romney's loss. And I wrote in the book, wouldn't it be interesting if Trump ever decides to actually get in the race? And of course he got in the race, and now he's turned the circus into almost a daily circus event. The tone would obviously be a major chapter, how the tone of the nation has turned so sour and so negative, so angry. We are not living through a big tent time period in American politics. We are living in small tribal tents, and there's not a lot of discussion going on between these tents. And I think that that's a problem going forward. But, to those that want to live in the negativity, or to those that want to see the glass as half empty, I would just say that, America ebbs and flows. And as somebody who loves presidential history, we've seen these time periods before where unpopular presidents or presidents who are not very inspirational get into office, and then they're typically replaced by a candidate who comes along who is an FDR, who is a John F. Kennedy, who is a Ronald Reagan, somebody who lifts the nation and begins to point out the reasons why we're more united than divided. So I think that Trump potentially could lead us into a time period of a lot of positive things when somebody else comes along that wants to rebuild the nation and create a bigger tent that all of us can be under.